Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Good evening to those that are online. Thanks for coming, well, sitting in your sitting rooms or whatever, and thanks to those of you that are here tonight. Thank you for the opportunity that Lighthouse Books has given me to speak about this book on Mick Lynch. The book is a celebration, but also a critique. It's a celebration of Mick Lynch for some obvious reasons, that he has been the first Union General Secretary in decades, if you like, to be able to have access to the national media, say things that other union leaders would wish they had been able to say, but they didn't have that platform. And when he's got that platform, he has done something quite remarkable, I think. Because of his persona, because of his politics, which I characterise as social democratic rather than socialist, he has been able to have a cutting edge in terms of criticising employers, the Westminster government, and often also neoliberal capitalism, and sometimes even capitalism itself. So he's been forthright and frank. He's been radical and robust. And if you cast your minds back to late June 2022, he certainly was not sort of bowed down and was not crushed by the likes of Piers Morgan, Richard Madeley, or Kay Burley. Piers Morgan was the one where he asked him if he was the Hood, who's the criminal mastermind from Thunderbirds. Richard Madeley of that was previously another life. It was Richard Judy of the book reviews and all that sort of stuff. Now he's a reactionary interviewer. He asked him if he was a Marxist, and if he was a Marxist, then of course he'd want to bring down capitalism. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your view, Mick Lynch said, "No, I'm not a Marxist." And then Kay Burley was in the sort of studio interviewing Mick Lynch on the picket line in Euston. And Mick Lynch is standing in front of 6 blokes behind him, being asked what a picket line involves. And he says, well, you can see what it involves. Whenever somebody comes to go into work, one of those blokes will try and say to them, we would like you not to go into work, we'd go on strike. And she was egging him on to say, well, where's the violence? Isn't this going to be like the miners' strike in 1985? So he was very good in dealing with all that. He took it back to what the issues of the dispute were. And one of the things I think that marks him out is that he was able to generalise out of what were essentially sectional disputes of the Network Rail, which is the state infrastructure company, and also the train operating company members, 20,000 in Network Rail, 20,000 in train operating companies. So he was able to generalise out from those sectional disputes to make points about precarious work, what the Tories were up to in terms of further implementing a neoliberal agenda. So it's a celebration for all those reasons, particularly when Mick Lynch has had no formal training. All he's done, if you like, is come to the union movement, and that obviously is a training in itself, but there are many union general secretaries who don't have this kind of star quality of being able to perform under pressure. However, the book is also a critique, because it would be remiss of me as a sort of social scientist and a socialist to examine him as a union leader without looking at both his strengths and weaknesses. So I've obviously alluded to the strengths as such, but there are also some weaknesses that I'm going to come on to. And those are weaknesses that have to be borne in mind of not just the RMT itself, but the union movement overall, and of course the left as well. So in the summer of 2022, Mick Lynch kind of bursts onto our screens, into our psyche, and people start calling him a working class hero, which is why the title of the book is The Making of a Working Class Hero. And I think it's quite significant that people of a quite young generation have decided to call him a working class hero, because even when Bob Crow was alive, he wasn't called a working class hero. It was only when he died in the 11th of March 2014. You'd have to go back to somebody like Arthur Scargill, either in the early 1970s when he organised flying pickets, or during the 84-85 strike. And of course, some people would have said that Arthur Scargill was not a working class hero, but he was a traitor simply because there was no ballot, and that was obviously a controversy at the time. I don't think anyone has called Mick Lynch a traitor, so it's quite different territory. But people started calling him this. And I think it's significant, as I say, that certainly on social media, younger people were calling on this. The newspapers were full of it as well. Sometimes it wasn't working class hero, sometimes it was folk hero or other kind of appellations. But when you think about it, why did people call him a working class hero? Well, the obvious thing is of what he was saying. And I want to kind of emphasize the saying is different from the doing, because we'll come and look at the outcome of the disputes and his politics and so on later on. But what he was saying was something that other people obviously agreed with, but didn't have the self-confidence or the ability to articulate in the way that he did. And they obviously didn't have the platform that he created for himself with those interviews. So the sense of being a hero is that people look to others to do things they cannot do themselves. Now that's, depending on the situation, that you may say that's a healthy or not a healthy situation. You may say, well, we should all be heroes in terms of being leaders in our own struggles and so on. But at the same time, you might say, well, given that the union movement up until 2022 was pretty much on the back foot, it's not such a bad thing that at least we have somebody like Mick Lynch. But the other side of it was working class. It's not often that we hear about class in Britain and Scotland in this day and age. And so when people were saying he was a working class hero, I think that was, again, had a significance. It wasn't just a workers' hero, it was a class, the emphasis was on class. So for those reasons, I say that's why I decided to call the book that. And obviously, it goes back to the likes of John Lennon and so on from the early 1970s when John Lennon was radicalised. A working class hero is something to be. The only other people I think that are called working class heroes at the moment might be the likes of Marcus Rashford, the Man United footballer. I don't know if he's still at Man U, that shows up my ignorance of football matters. But at the time, when he was campaigning for meals for kids, free school meals, and talking about his own background, he had that appellation. You go back and you might also find the likes of George Best and some others. So that, I think it was significant that people started calling him that. And essentially, Mick Lynch was in the right place at the right time, saying the right things. Whether he was doing the right things is something that I will, as I say, come on to shortly. Now, why was it Mick Lynch and not other union leaders? Well, first and foremost, the RMT was almost the first and only union to have a national strike. The only major strike before that in the summer of 2022 was British Telecom, which doesn't quite carry the same social weight. So Mick Lynch is out on, leading his members out in strike. The CW, the Communication Workers Union, and its leader Dave Ward, they didn't go on strike until August. So Mick Lynch, if you like, in addition to the persona and the politics, he has the opportunity to be first out of the traps. In 2021, strikes were at their lowest level in Britain since records began, and some of those records went back to 1891. So to go from a period of quiescence, even if it was reluctant and grudging acceptance of the situation, to mobilisation through strikes was quite something. And of course, Mick Lynch seemed to be at the head of that. And then there's a couple of other contingent factors. Jeremy Corbyn had been defenestrated from the leadership of the Labour Party, and therefore that allowed somebody of his ilk in terms of social democratic politics to fill that vacuum, which Mick Lynch did quite eloquently. And of course, the bigger contextual factor is the cost of living crisis. So for all those reasons, Mick Lynch is able to become this person. And again, the emphasis is on what he's saying at that point in time, not necessarily what he's doing. So in trying to understand why he ends up being in the position he's in, I use a kind of fourfold characterization or schema: the persona of the individual Mick Lynch, his politics, which is, say, are social democratic to my mind, the political period that we're in, which is the electoral death spiral of the Tories, the rise of Starmer-led Labour Party, and the fourth aspect is the potential power of his members. Railway workers, I think most people would assume, are one of the most powerful groups of workers that you could have in developed countries, particularly in Britain. It's when they go on strike, particularly the signal workers, then virtually no trains run, and that seems to be something that all trade unionists would want to have an immediate and huge impact to their strike action. The problem is, and this is one of the major kind of conundrums in the book that I examine is that the power to disrupt, that is to shut down the network, the rail network, isn't synonymous with developing or generating power over the bargaining partner. That is to say that you don't necessarily get what you want, what your demands are. And I'll come on to examine this. But before that, there are 3 accidents of history that explain why Mick Lynch ended up being the General Secretary from May 2021 onwards. The first is that he was blacklisted when he was working in the construction industry. He leaves school at 16, he gets an apprenticeship. He's from an Irish Catholic background. Locally, the area he grew up is known as County Kilburn, as in Kilburn, North London. His mother and father are Labour Party supporters. His dad is a shop steward. He was actually working in the post office in the 1971 strike. So there is a background in terms of politics, left-wing politics, not massively left-wing, just kind of old Labourish. He grows up in that background, gets his choice of apprenticeships, joins a company which makes and installs printing equipment, printing plant equipment. But he leaves that and takes his skills and goes into construction, electrical engineering type skills. But because he's been active in his union, which then was the EEPTU, one of the most right-wing unions at the time, that union is then expelled from the TUC for signing single union no strike agreements in the mid-1980s. He's part and parcel of the attempt to establish a new union, which is the Electrical and Plumbing Industries Union. So he kind of cuts his teeth in a right-wing union, trying to oppose the leadership, but also then starting up a new union. And then, as I say, he's blacklisted. So he needs to have an income. His wife does work, she's a nurse, but he needs he helps establish, pretty much leads the way in establishing an RMT branch of 500 members. So that's the first accident, if you like, of history. He ends up working. That's in history. Obviously, a much one is the death of Bob Crow on the 11th of March 2014. Essentially, that creates a vacancy at the top of the union, and although all these positions are elected, when somebody moves up, it creates a vacancy underneath. And that explains why in 2016, Mick Lynch was in the position of Assistant General Secretary, which he obviously won. Third and final accident of history is that Mick Cash, his predecessor as General Secretary, resigned because he couldn't get his way at the top of the union over a faction fight. And again, I'll explain what that's about. So this helps explain why it is that Mick Lynch ends up being the General Secretary at a certain point in time. So that's the process, if you like. What I want to go on now is to look at his politics, the settlements of those 2 national strikes, his leadership style and what it amounts to, and look at the materials and sources that I used to write the book with. So as I've said, Mick Lynch is not a Marxist, he's not a communist, he's not a revolutionary, he is a social democrat. And that's sometimes a term that he himself says he is, particularly when he's been interviewed at length by the likes of Ian Dale and LBC. So in a nutshell, social democracy is an attempt to more equitably regulate the relationship between capital and labour under capitalism. It's not the abolition of capitalism, as you would expect from socialism. And in fact, in one of these long interviews, Mick Lynch made clear that he was in Petrograd in 1917, the October 1917 revolution. He would have sided with Julius Martov and not Vladimir Lenin. So Martov was the leader of the Mensheviks, who had considerable political differences with Lenin over the nature of revolution or socialism. So that's Mick Lynch's politics, and therefore it's not a surprise that one of his heroes is Clement Attlee, Labour Prime Minister from 1945 to 51, leader of the Labour Party in government, which was called the Great Reforming Government, that many people look back on. People of all different shades of the left would look back on Clement Attlee and that Labour government as the high tide of what the Labour Party has been able to achieve. But Clement Attlee wasn't a revolutionary. He was, again, a social democrat, even though he had a more radical past in the 1950s when he was a member of the Socialist League. So the National Health Service is set up. The development of what we now know as kind of comprehensive education started then. the mines were nationalised, the railways were nationalised, the health service was set up, and so on and so forth. So all progressive developments, but it's also interesting to bear in mind that at the same time, that Labour government developed Britain's nuclear bomb. It was not keen to give up the colonies that were part of the British Empire, and it supported America very loyally in terms of, at that stage, things like what was about to become the Korean War. So in looking back at those politics, I think what we should have some understanding is this, if you like, it was the post-war kind of settlement, post-war compromise, which was an advance for the working class, but it wasn't a total advance, because the reason why the railways were nationalised was not at the behest of the railway workers, but it was because the government had to stabilise capitalism after the war. And in order to stabilise a capitalist economy, you need a decent railway system in order to be part and parcel of that infrastructure. So trying to get a kind of, pros and cons, if you like, of that Labour government. So it's not a surprise that that would be one of Mick Lynch's heroes. Probably what is more surprising is that he also says that Harold Wilson before him, and then Jim Callaghan were heroes. Now, Harold Wilson, many people would probably only know him for his association with the Beatles and the fact that there was a massive expansion of higher education, the kind of red brick universities that were developed in the late 60s. Other than that, in the white heat technological revolution, you wouldn't really put Harold Wilson up on any kind of pedestal. And even less so with Jim Callaghan, who was Wilson's successor, particularly because under Callaghan, Dennis Healey, the Chancellor of Exchequer, goes to the International Monetary Fund in New York, cap in hand, if you like, to ask for a bailout. The terms of that bailout are to cut public expenditure. And the first real cash term cuts in the NHS take place under Labour in that period, 74 to 79, not under Margaret Thatcher. And then we come to James Connolly, the Irish link. There are only certain bits of James Connolly that Mick Lynch is in favour of. It's self-educated. So James Connolly, born in Little Ireland in Edinburgh, moves to Ireland, moves to America as a union organiser in both those countries. He's in favour of us being self-educated, kind of autodidact, edits newspapers, organises people, union organiser, as I say. Clearly an anti-imperialist in terms of his role in Ireland and the Easter Uprising. But the bit of James Connolly that Mick Lynch isn't so enamoured with is the James Connolly, the Socialist Revolutionary, one of the founders of the Irish Citizens Army that plays a role in the Easter Uprising. And James Connolly says to his followers, don't give up your guns. We might need them after the Easter Uprising, assuming it was successful, because the very people that Connolly and the Irish Citizens Army are allied to will become the enemies. So that's not the kind of things that I say that Mick Lynch is enamoured with. So that gives you some sense that he seems more radical than he is because of the political period that we're living through. And that's true of many people. I think that would be true of Jeremy Corbyn as well. Just a couple of more things about what social democracy would look like. And I don't want to kind of, as it were, piss on the parade of social democracy, far from it, because social democracy would involve things like price controls, not only on rent, but basic foodstuffs, energy, and so on. The very things that we don't actually have in any meaningful sense at the moment. It would also involve redistribution of wealth. So social democracy would use the state to intervene in the processes of the market, but also the outcomes to make them more equitable. So now I come on to the settlements of the two disputes, which I think have huge ramifications for other unions, other strikes, and the general future of the union movement. And at the outset, I want to make clear that the two offers from Network Rail, the infrastructure company, state-owned infrastructure company, and the train operating companies were 2%, a one-year deal, 2% plus strings. What the settlements end up being is 4 to 5% without strings. So I don't want to sniff at that outcome, but at the same time, I want to make it clear that it's not the outcome that the RMT should have achieved, and it's not the outcome that many of us would have expected the RMT to achieve. And essentially, what you have is a settlement on the pay front, which is half the level of inflation, at least half the level of inflation at the time. level inflation has been 10% or more, depending on whether you use CPI or RPI. So it's a real terms pay cut, but it's also one that effectively the RMT members that were on strike have had to pay for, because they were on strike for between 20 and 30 days in those two disputes without strike pay. So they've made a sacrifice of, at least 2, if not 3 or more weeks' wages. And then the final thing is that the settlements were there or thereabouts 18 months late. So you don't get your pay rise that you should have had on the 1st of April 2022 until April 2023 or November 2023, depending on which company you work for. So I want to explain this situation as to why that comes about when the RMT, as many people think, is the most powerful union in Britain, but it's shown up not to be. And again, this hinges on the issue of the distinction between the power to disrupt and the power over, generating power over the bargaining partner. Now, the various parts of the left have said that the reason why this outcome, or these two outcomes have come about, is because there was insufficient escalation of the dispute. There should have been more strikes, there should have been more strikes over shorter periods of time, and the action would therefore have been more effective. And while there is something to that, it's not the complete story, because the situation is actually much more complex rather than that would suggest. And here it is that I think this is the most telling critique of Mick Lynch, and that is to say that he has shown a lack of ability to strategically plan how you go into two national disputes. And the reason why I say that is, first of all, to use a metaphor, there was already a train coming down the track. That is to say that whether it was the previous Labour government under Gordon Brown, when he was Prime Minister after Tony Blair, or under the Tories, whether it's David Cameron or subsequent Prime Ministers, all of them wanted to reform the railway industry. So under the last Labour government commissioned Ray McNulty to publish a report, which he did. It came out actually when David Cameron was Prime Minister. Then the Tories commissioned their own Williams report, which was later in the 2010s. And all of them were about cutting the public subsidy to the railways by virtue of cutting numbers, staff numbers, headcount, but also making workers work more flexibly. In other words, making them work more intensively. That was well known, but the following things were also well known before the RMT and Mick Lynch as General Secretary entered into the dispute. The first thing is that the strike on Network Rail, the strike losses are indemnified. So there are no strike losses because the state company and the Tories are willing to spend millions and millions of pounds, as I'll explain in a moment, letting that dispute happen, not settling, extending it. So you go into the dispute knowing that you're actually up against the government, directly in the case of Network Rail. But what I think most people are not aware of is that all the train operating companies, those that are in the private sector, because there are now, of course, 4 that are not, and I'm not talking about Scotland or Transport Wales, but the ones in England, most of them are in private hands, and they also are indemnified against strike losses. And that is because during COVID, all the franchises were changed to management fee contracts. So basically all those train operating companies are given a set fee to run the franchise in their area. It doesn't matter whether ticket sales are great or awful, set fee. That comes about because billions of pounds were pumped into the railways during COVID, during the pandemic, in order to keep them running. And the government used that as an opportunity to change the contracts. Part and parcel of that contract is that the train operating companies are not able to make agreements with the RMT or other unions without the say-so of the Westminster government. So the point I'm making here is that the RMT went into these two disputes knowing that. I'm not saying, I don't for 1 minute say that they shouldn't have gone into disputes, but they went into those disputes knowing that this was a situation. And to give you an idea of what the strike indemnification meant, from June 2022, late June when the strike started, to early January 2023, Hugh Merriman, who's the Transport Minister, was asked at the House of Commons Select Committee, he was asked the question, would £1 billion have been enough to settle the two disputes? Now, he didn't question the figure of £1 billion, as in the amount of losses that were incurred. He went on and just said, yes, it would have been enough. So the fact that the Tories were willing to spend £1 billion by indemnifying the companies in terms of their strike loss, what would have been their strike losses, for only about 6 or 7 months, gives you an indication that the whole amount of money that was spent in the two disputes, which ran on into 2023, could have been around 2 billion. So this means that when you go on strike, most strikes are economic strikes, you try and hurt the employer in the pocket, it's not going to work. You've then got to start thinking about how do you transform an economic strike into political strike. And that cost of 1 billion plus, maybe another billion on top of it gives you some idea of what the Tories were trying to do. Mick, Lynch, for them, and the union movements, but also the RMT, were great bogeymen in terms of setting up something that the Tories were trying to say that, this is the chaos that we're trying to stop. This is the way that we're trying to resuscitate our electoral fortunes. They're not just using this, it's stop the votes and all the anti-immigrant stuff, but it is very much against the unions, using this as a way to try to obviously target Labour and Starmer, which didn't work, obviously, because Starmer didn't support the strikes, as I'll come on to in a moment. So the Tories are prepared to spend huge amounts of money in doing this, plus the fact that the RMT should have paid much greater attention to these factors. And then you come to Labour. Back in the day, most unions would have hoped and expected that a Labour Party in opposition would have helped generate political heat on the government of the day by, if you like, making the strikes into political hot potatoes. So at question time in the House of Commons every Wednesday, they would have expected the leader of the Labour Party to start saying, the kind of things this dispute's costing millions and millions of pounds, hundreds of millions of pounds. It'd be cheaper to settle. The cause of the strikers is just, and so on. It's all about neoliberalism, blah blah blah. Of course, Starmer does none of that. One, because he believes the narrative that higher wages cause inflation and not the other way around. He doesn't support unions, and his strategy of moving to the right has paid massive dividends. Unfortunately, it has. We have to recognise this, that from late 2021, Labour Party starts to move ahead of the Tories in the polls. By a year later, Labour's lead over the Tories is always double digits, sometimes 15%, sometimes 20%, sometimes 25%, and sometimes even as high as 30%. So you're not going to get any support from Labour. And again, that's something that the RMT and Mick Lynch and other unions should have realised. When Starmer was elected, he was elected on the basis of saying he would maintain the policy platform of Corbyn. And of course, what he's done over time is exactly the opposite. And the only thing I think that's of any worth that's still left in the kind of prospective Labour manifesto to have it tabled in the House of Commons within the first 100 days will actually come about. So you would go into that dispute knowing that Labour wasn't going to be supporting you. You would, of course, still say that Labour should be doing X and should be doing Y, but you wouldn't, bet your house on it because you knew it wasn't going to happen. And therefore, that comes to the launch of an organisation called Enough is Enough, which did show some thinking and some imagination. Enough is Enough was launched in August 2022, primarily by the CWU union and the RMT union, but also by the likes of Tribune and some Labour-left MPs like Sarah Sultana. So it's a good thing that it's launched. Within a matter of weeks, it's not a membership organisation, but within a matter of weeks, it has between 750,000 and 1 million people signed up to it. The rallies that it creates, that it has rather, are very well attended. I remember the one, not because I was there personally, but the one in Manchester Cathedral, it was so big that in the people grounds. So it's a good initiative, but the problem is that within a matter of 6 or more months, it's effectively defunct. The last protest it calls is against the minimum service levels bill at that time in January 2023. And its weaknesses are that although it has 5 basic demands, which I think are not controversial, the weaknesses is in strategy. It only calls rallies and demonstrations. It doesn't try and get people to do anything more than that. As I say, it's defunct by spring 2023. It was formed too late, as in formed in the heat of the dispute, not prior to it. Again, showing, I think, a lack of strategic planning. and it was too bound up with the two disputes of the CWU and the RMT. And effectively, when those two disputes are held no longer to have much use for enough is enough, then enough is enough stops being stops being active and vibrant. And what's interesting is that the ticket office closure campaign, which takes place in the latter half of 2023, is successful. Now, the key difference between the two, that campaign and Enough is Enough, is at least the ticket office closure campaign asked people to do something. It wasn't a huge thing, but it was to make a submission to the consultation process, and of course it was successful. So I think some lessons can be learned about that. The final, and I think most telling criticism of Lynch's leadership and the RMT is over the issue of strike pay. Just let me give you an aside. The Unite Union, since Sharon Graham has become General Secretary in August 2021, has spent between August 2021 and September 2023, the Unite Union has spent £32 million in strike pay. That covers 900 strikes involving 200,000 workers that generated an extra 400 million in those wage packets for those strikers. Now, there is a difference between the RMT and Unite. The RMT is a minnow compared to the kind of Unite, which is in excess of 1 million members. The RMT has about 80,000 members. But there's still something fundamentally profound there in terms of strike pay. So Mick Lynch becomes Assistant General Secretary in 2016, and for the next 3 or 4 years, there are long strikes and disputes over driver-only operations. In excess of 200 strike days are taken in 8 train operating companies. And one of the disputes lasts for 4 years. And the simple reason for that is that RMT members in those train operating companies are not willing to take more than a single day's strike every maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks, because there is no strike pay. That's why they say to their officers, the full-time officers, that's all they'll do. And quite often it's on like a Sunday, so that they have a kind of more of a weekend or something like that, or Saturday, whatever it is. So what I'm about to say is my suggestion about how you square that circle. And it obviously comes down to providing strike pay. I mean, there are other things necessary, as I've tried to outline in terms of political aspects, but in terms of strike pay, how do you square the circle? Well, this is the suggestion that I have, and I would like the RMT to take it up, but as I'll explain in a moment, it's been met with deafening silence. The RMT has between 25 and 26 million pounds in stocks and shares. Now, it's not particularly unusual for unions to have stocks and shares in capitalism. They do that. Those of us on the left would question this, but the fact is they do it. If you were the RMT going into 2 national disputes where you have 40,000 members going to be on strike, you should have strike pay. The national dispute fund that they do have, which has been long-standing, is insufficient. It's not of the right scale to finance those strikers. So you would sell the stocks and shares. You would also levy your members, whether it was the striking members or the whole union, and say you would maybe add another £5 million to that £25 million that you realised through stocks and shares. You would then be able to apply that selectively, because if you pay 40,000 workers on strike £70 a day with £30 million, I reckon it's only going to last about 10 days. And obviously the government would be prepared to wait that out. So what you would do is apply it selectively. You would say, what we will do is we'll take the signallers out on all the mainline routes. So London to Edinburgh, London to Glasgow, London to Manchester, London to Newcastle, Birmingham, blah, 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 that sort of thing. You wouldn't take the signallers out in the kind of rural areas or the relatively depopulated areas of the country. And in terms of the train operating companies, you would target London and the southeast, where most of the population lives, where most commuting into London happens. We know that the media is largely London-centric, so you're going to pick up more there. So you could do that if you thought strategically and in advance of doing that. And I think that wouldn't necessarily have resulted in the RMT winning hands down, but it would have made a huge difference. So I think there are lessons to be learned from that. Coming on, the last couple of things I want to say about leadership. So Mick Lynch is the General Secretary of the Unite Union. He will probably come across to people who hear him on the radio or television or on any podcast He'll come across as very urbane, very calm and collected, kind of canny operator, but he will not give you a sense that he has a tendency to be authoritarian. So let me explain what I mean by that. I mentioned earlier that Mick Cash resigned as General Secretary from the Union because he lost a faction fight. So in the RMT, as with all unions, their annual general conference, assuming it's annual, their annual general conference is effectively the parliament that they have, but it only meets for like once 1 week per year. So the question is, who manages, runs, controls the union for the other 51 weeks of the year? Well, this dispute that led to Mick Cash resigning was about differing and contradictory conceptions of union democracy. Mick Cash, Mick Lynch, and the other union officers believe that they, as directly elected officers of the union, should be, in control of the union. The majority of the national executive, lay elected positions in the RMT, they believe they should have been in control of the union, and they would cite the constitution of their own union, saying that it was up to the NEC, National Executive Committee, to guide and guide the work of the national officials. So there's a big fight, which effectively Mick Lynch wins, and that is solidified by when he's elected General Secretary in May 2021. So it gives you some idea of his some indication rather of the kind of way that he engages as a leader. I don't think you could say he was a particularly doesn't engage in distributed leadership or participative leadership. As I say, I think there are some authoritarian tendencies, and the testimony that I took from people suggest that he can be quite petulant behind the scenes if he doesn't get his own way. He, reminds of that from time to time. So he is a very crow, but he operates in a different style. So in terms of leadership, I think it's the health, but that is the case. And of course, as a result of those interviews and the early time of those two national disputes, he has massive political authority in the union. And last year, there was a few inklings there would be motions criticising him at the RMT conference, but you wouldn't want to, in the midst of a dispute, to be criticising your own side because it might give a hostage fortune to others. So that's something about Mick Lynch's leadership. Let me just finally come to the issue of materials and sources. Unfortunately, Mick Lynch declined to be interviewed for the writing of this book, which is quite astonishing in a way because he has been interviewed by every man and his dog, if you'd like to use that phrase, elsewhere. I mean, I was effectively asking for a few hours of his time, but that was declined. I've never been given an explanation for it. I can surmise as to what the reasons might be, but I don't actually know because I've never been directly communicated. I've just told he was press officer that he was not interested. So in that situation, I had to accept it. But fortunately, if you like, because of all those other interviews that deal with his family background and because of research I was able to do, testimony I was able to take, I have been able to generate the material that I needed to write the book. All the testimony that I took was given, I gave those people that gave me the testimony a guarantee of confidentiality, and also that I would anonymise their quotes in the book. And that again gives you some indication of the kind of internal culture of the union, as do the following things. On the 1st of March last year, I wrote to all the RMT branches asking them to give me their assessment of Mick Lynch. Short 5-question questionnaire, 300 branches of which all the email addresses are freely available on the RMT's website. Later that afternoon, from one of my contacts inside the RMT, I got a copy of an email from the RMT headquarters saying to their branches, if you've got this email, delete it. And once you've deleted it, delete it from your delete box. Mm-hmm. So a kind of a bit of a warning. And then I'll give you other examples, but the main obvious one is that last November, the publisher, Manchester University Press, wrote to those branches and said the book's going to coming out. If you buy it before the publication date, 30% off. The publisher, Manchester University Press, got a cease and desist letter from the RMT. So I whatever the particular reasons as to why Mick Lynch wouldn't give me the time to interview him, which I say I don't know because it's not been explained. Clearly, there's a level of hostility from the RNT. So last week in Belfast, the discussant from the ICTU Northern Committee pulled out. Belfast Trades Council wasn't represented at the meeting. There is an attempt by the RNT and by Lynch to do what they can to prevent the kind of wider circulation of this book, which I think is unfortunate because I'll finish on this point. I think the most productive and progressive way to go forward on this is let's have an open and public debate on it. I don't see what the RNT is so scared of in terms of not wanting to debate the issues, wanting to do what it can to, prevent people knowing about the book. But that's the decision they've made. But I've decided that Mick Lynch has many qualities that still need to be, assessed and analysed, and therefore that's why I continue to write the book. Thank you.
Thank you. There are a few questions online, so I wonder if I put those to you first, and then while people have a think. So from Jean, we keep seeing Eton Oxbridge boys rise to the top. How do we bring our own leaders, and why aren't there more women leading on the left?
A very good question, because the first sentence in the book is making it clear that Mick Lynch becomes a working class hero as a male, white, older man, well, obviously male than man, bald as well. And it's interesting that that happened because he speaks to a very kind of male, pale, stale kind of aspect of trade unionism in Britain. So it's interesting that that happens despite the fact he has those characteristics. And many women, are also calling him a working class hero. But I think in the wider situation, he needs his kind of profile as that working class hero. It needs to be balanced out by other union leaders. And I suppose I wouldn't necessarily talk about Christina McInerney of Unison in these terms. I would be thinking more in terms of Sharon Graham and other women union leaders who are more radical, who are more left wing. They need to get the profile which will allow them to have the kind of more of an impact. However you think that would work in terms of role models or just some kind of general form of encouragement. So, I think in general terms, it's a good thing that Mick Lynch has been characterised as that, but there are limitations to it. And we would have to hope that because of the kind of thing that I talked about, Unite, and why Sharon Graham was elected as a kind of back to the workplace against the continuity candidates that were going to be continuity with Lionel Husky, the previous General Secretary, we would have to hope that her profile will develop and will come to fruition equally as much as Mick Lynch's, but there aren't any easy answers to that.
I think there's a question that probably connects to that, which was from Noor. Mick Lynch broke through to the media during the strike wave, but we've not seen much since. How do we get more airtime for leaders like him or leaders from unions?
Well, unless the unions and the left have their own, media, which I know they do, but it's not at the kind of same scale and level, then unfortunately we are reliant upon the mainstream media, the kind of the BBCs and the Telegraph and the Times and all that sort of thing. So it's difficult. Yes, Mick Lynch's profile has gone down, not because anything substantial has changed, other than the fact that the two disputes are now over for the time being. It might be the case that his profile will rise again, but probably not back to what it was for two reasons. One is we're in a period of the run-up to the election, probably in November this year, and Mick Lynch is a great talking head to criticise Starmer, so we'd like to see more from that account. But also the deal that settled the train operating company dispute is a 2-year deal. The first year has been kind of signed off, but the RNT is about to go back into negotiations on a company-by-company basis, not a national basis, but a company-by-company basis from April this year. And there may be some more strikes, there may not be. We wait and see. But if there are, again, I think his profile will come back. But what's interesting, if you look at the strike figures, is that the strike wave that has existed from the summer of 2022 onwards is the media really is only interested in the unions when strikes are happening. They're not interested in the internal processes of unions. They're not interested in the extent to which there is or isn't membership participation. They're interested in disruption because that's their narrative. Unions cause chaos. Unions cause strikes, not management cause strikes. And say it may resuscitate a little bit, but only from the mainstream media as they try and make mischief, by using union leaders to undermine Starmer. Unfortunately, undermine Starmer from the right and not from the left.
Are there any?
Ask a question of Gregor in the context of Mick Lynch and his versus the fame or his personal profile versus at a time when there was predictions going around about the saving the movement part. And you are highlighting the fact that after 2022, the union membership in Britain went down during the period of that spring. And I think what's interesting, and I wonder if you bring out in the book about the wider question here is the trade union movement in Britain is in a profound period of difficulty. Trade union membership is low. Perhaps you could tell us what percentage, for example, of the private sector is even a union. Activism levels are low.
Yeah.
The age profile of the trade union movement is high. I mean, I spent 2023, I was on the RFP picket line, the ASLEF picket line, the bin men in Edinburgh on strike, remember? During the Edinburgh Festival, the EIS was on strike, the fire brigades had a rally at the Parliament, PCS was on strike, UCU was on strike, and it seemed to me that strike, what they had in common was the rate of inflation. The prices were not by 10% and their wages on it. That was what it was about. Now we're at it. And I think that the big question to ask is, where does Mick Lynch and the other trade unions stand in addressing those fundamental questions? Has this become a union movement in inverted commas come and gone? Has any of those profound questions been addressed or not?
I think it's
Speaking the mic just for anyone online.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a comfort blanket for many. So I do detect this is happening to say, the unions are back, you're back, things are getting better. And I think it's at best it's only a temporary fillip, which is not what you'd want to say or conclude, but I think that's the reality of the situation. So yeah, you're right. In 2022, union membership went down by 200,000, largely amongst women. I'm not sure that what the particular explanation for that is. And that most of those women are in the public sector because that's where most women who are union members are. The figures for 2023 will come out in May this year. Whether there'll be another drop, I don't know, but I wouldn't expect that if there is any rise for it to be a significant one. So it's not like we really are back. We're in a situation where the decline in union membership is only like kind of plateaued. It's not stopped. And we're in a period when, even if there is a Starmer-led government, there are going to be very limited changes in terms of support for unions in public policy and legislation. So we're not about to sort of see an upturn of the fortunes of unions. We are in a continued period of difficulty. Because the bigger picture is that there's a continued domination of neoliberalism in Britain and Europe around the world, despite all the, despite the financial crash 2008, 2009, despite COVID, when there was massive state expenditure. All those things were about states intervening to save neoliberal capitalism, not to get rid of it. So we don't live in a post-neoliberal world. What does Mick Lynch do? Well, I suppose at the most you can say that he has given a voice to many people who don't have a voice, the kind of point I was making at the outset of this talk. But more than that, he hasn't come up, and I do examine this point in the book, has he come up with a new style of operating as a union or a new style of leadership? Well, the simple answer is no. And towards the end of the book, I'll look at, again, where the limitations are that lie there. And, in some ways that's, I wouldn't say it was an unfair criticism of him, but it's maybe quite a demanding criticism, because when people call him a working class hero, the expectations of him as an individual were probably quite high. Was it the case that somehow a single individual could almost single-handedly turn around the fortunes of the union movement by dint of example or inspiration. Well, you know, those of us that are long in the tooth will know the answer to that is a resounding no. But I think a lot of people, because the union movement was so weak, because the left was on the back foot, they did end up having that kind of leap of faith, which I think was not particularly helpful or realistic. So unions are in a difficult situation. Even Unite, which I mentioned earlier about those figures, strike pay, strike wins, all that sort of stuff, their membership was only going up by, you know, in the tens of thousands. If Unite is the best example of strike mobilisation in Britain, it's not paying massive dividends in terms of union membership, because where they are most effective is in the likes of transport, refuse collection, where they are the single union, if not the dominant union. You look at the situation of Unite in local government or the health service, they've not had the same wins there elsewhere, because sometimes Unison has been, you know, the bigger union there. So we're in this difficult situation. And again, the left would say, particularly those from the Trotskyist left would say, well, struggle builds unions. Well, I unfortunately don't see the evidence of that, not just in terms of the reduction in union membership, but if strikes really do build unions, you know, thinking back to the sort of late 60s, early 70s, then the problem is we're kind of comparing apples and pears, or, you know, it's chalk and cheese kind of situation, because great as though the strike wave was, and, you know, it's the biggest strike wave in 40 years in Britain, it's still tiny compared to what we have experienced before, back in the day when unions were much stronger, when they really could, you know, to use a phrase from, I think it was Hugh Scanlon, you know, park their tanks on the lawn of Downing Street. We are unfortunately in that situation. And I was, you know, asked the same kind of question in Belfast last week. And in terms of unions on the left, unfortunately, I just don't see there is any obvious answer as to how do we turn around fortunes. We obviously have to maintain our critique in our socialist politics and our radicalism and criticism of our opponents in the capitalist system. We need to keep that, because without that, nothing will ever happen. But while that's necessary, it's not sufficient. And, you know, as I say, I don't see that the strike wave that has happened has completely replenished our fortunes or the activist base. So we have to keep going in the hope, because it is no more than that, in the hope that things will get better at some point. So not the most uplifting of responses, but I think that's, you know, an honest one.
Yeah, go for it.
Let me just get this to you, Mike. What else come forward? Sorry.
It was just asked about, guess the traditional tools available to trade unions during disputes. And it's interesting that while superficially it would appear as if Mick Lynch and the RMT were exercising those tools very effectively and gained a kind of media platform that we've not seen for a wee while, as you say, they nonetheless, the actual outcome of their dispute was not what their members were going on strike for. We've, in my own union, we've had similar experiences. And we did actually for a wee while in the EISL, the College Lecturers Union, they were paying up full wages at one point locally. We don't do it nationally, but on occasion we will do it locally. And I just wonder, every sector, every occupation is different. Saying earlier on that we, amongst further education lecturers, have got limited leverage on our employers. There's a very strong view amongst our members now that when we go on strike in a pay dispute, we're actually paying for our own settlement ultimately. And that settlement has not been inflation proof since as far back as I can remember, to be honest, Gregor. So some of us are now beginning, I'm just interested in your thoughts where we might go with this and what the alternative models of dispute we might develop. Obviously, withdrawing our labour, picket lines, all the usual stuff is essential. We can't throw the baby out in the bathwater. But one of the things we're thinking of doing is just going into communities around campuses, having public meetings, leafleting door to door, and just raising the alarm about the fact that further education is not just under threat from one or two cuts, that there's an existential crisis in the public asset that your community has been used to might not be here in 2 years, you know. So that I'm just wondering, in light of this wave of militancy that Colin describes and actually ended up with a lowering of trade union capacity, whether that is a wake-up call to the movement to begin collectively developing more creative, more novel forms of action.
Thanks for that, Mike. Yes, I think it is a wake-up call. It needs to lead to a reimagining of what effective action looks like. And I suppose there are two things that I would draw out of the study of Mick Lynch and the RMT. The one is unions need to have a better understanding of how you develop political leaders, because, as I said, most strikes in the public sector, you're not trying to hurt the boss in the pocket as you would do in the private sector. So there's got to be more thought going into how do you develop political leverage, notwithstanding the difficulties that you have with Keir Starmer leading the Labour Party or Anna Sarwar leading the Scottish Labour Party. I mean, the SNP in Holyrood, up to a point, is sensitive to its reputation. I think that was the case with the teachers, but obviously it's not been the case with the college lecturers. So we'll have to develop that. And I think your suggestion about going to communities is one thing, but I think there's a couple of other things that are probably going to lead to greater leverage and more quickly. The one is that I think unions need to start thinking about direct action. Now, it's not just because I'm thinking about the farmers that have been taking action in Spain, France, Italy, Germany. But when we go on strike, and you can take this from the picket line, most picket lines don't actually try and stop people going into work, certainly not physically. Yeah, they might try and argue with them. So if you transfer that issue about how do you actually stop things, then I think that unions need to think in terms of how do they disrupt transport network, not the rail network necessarily, the road network. How do they stop the day-to-day functioning of capitalism or an economy or society? And I'm always taken back to the likes of French workers who have different traditions, partly because the Communist Party there historically has been much more important, but also because the Communist Party was shut out of mainstream politics, so they had to develop. But I think they have developed direct action tactics. Now, the obvious case with farmers is they take sheep into the Arc de Triomphe and the Champs-Élysées and so on. They actually just, Paris ends up being gridlock. But in other examples, farmers in Spain, and these are small farmers, so they're not kind of big capitalists, they're sort of small farmers. They're taking their tractors onto motorways and, either just park on the motorways or they just go very slow, and so that has an impact. So I think we need to think about direct action, but I'm also thinking about the likes of Palestine Action, so the kind of lessons that the union movement might be able to learn from there about how you stop production, albeit that's to do with arms for Israel. So I think there are some things that we need to start rethinking without thinking we can go back to the days of mass pickets, whether it's stopping getting Saltley Gates and the miners' strike in the early 1970s closed down or having a successful org leave. I think there are other things we need to do. And I think, again, Unite in some ways shows us a bit more strategic thinking, because what they do is they have these things called leverage campaigns, which does involve strike action, but it's not solely predicated on strike action. They think about who are the sort of downstream suppliers of whatever it is you're making. And then they think about the upstream buyers and how you can try to exert leverage on those two aspects in order to, concentrate on the employer that you're doing, that you're concerned with wherever you work. So none of those are, magic bullets, magic kind of panaceas, but I think we do need to start there. And the final thing in terms of the kind of the political hot potato is that many union leaders, including Mick Lynch, would talk about a general strike. Now, the position of the RMT is we're in favour of a general strike and we'll support it if it's called. Well, I remember Bob Crow did much more than that when he was General Secretary. He actually took motions to TUC in the early 2010s calling for a general strike they were passed, but obviously nothing much happened. So I think the RMT is kind of, shied away a bit from there, but as have other union leaders. So there are only two instances, I think the 1st of February and the 15th of March, when there was limited coordination of strikes across Britain. We go back to 2011, the pension strike, there was many more million workers on strike then. So there's an issue about why is it that unions seem to have an overriding sectional concern to their disputes, rather than seeing the bigger picture. And again, when most union members are public sector members, therefore they need to have political strikes effectively, why is it union leaders are so reticent to involve themselves in that kind of work? I don't have the answer to that. I can see there's a problem even if I don't have the answer to it. So I think there are a number of things we can do. And hopefully, you have to live in hope, as I say, hopefully we're going to sort some of these things out for the next time that we need to use them. But again, it's not a message of unbounded optimism.
So we have time for one more question, and I have one from Terry online, which is, has Lynch had much to say on just transitions and trade unions in the climate crisis?
Not an awful lot, but then, not an awful lot. The context, of course, is that transport can play a role in limiting, carbon footprints and helping decarbonisation, particularly when the RMT has some membership, limited membership, in the production of wind turbines and so on, and HS2 for all the kind of destruction of the countryside, may end up leading to less road traffic. So there is that context, but he hasn't said much about it, I suppose, because he's been at certain times preoccupied with the disputes. Then again, many union leaders haven't made it a great priority either. Certain unions have, if you like, particularly with the issue of North Sea oil, have been quite slow to start thinking about the just transition. They've got a case, a strong point when they say, well, if you're going to relinquish people from their jobs, then obviously you need to have transferable skills or reskilling and so on. That's all fair comment, but there just seems to be the using of that maybe as a little more of an excuse to stop doing anything or making much progress rather than going ahead. And I'm reminded by something that Colin Fox said several years ago about Gary Smith, who's the General Secretary of the GMB. He was lampooning his position about the nuclear industry and other things. And he said that if Gary Smith had been the leader of the GMB back in the days of slavery, he would have defended his members' jobs to make the manacles that the slaves were held in. And that's obviously a lampooning, massive exaggeration, but it does speak to the point that the defence of existing jobs doesn't show the political willingness or imagination to move things on. I mean, capitalism is a very dynamic system, so we can, play our part in changing the situation. It doesn't have to always be quite as it is. So he said something, but not enough. But then, in fairness, say the other union leaders that can be criticised for being a little less vocal on that as well.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for coming and listening.